current leadership.
Hang on, I'm just going to. So it's my pleasure to introduce Noru, who has given us already 4 talks to the South London Israel Forum over the past few years, most of them over the past 12 months, and they've all been absolutely first class. We get fantastic feedback on them. I think because Noru has a particular approach. He's always got analysis alongside facts, very clearly explained, and he takes an unusual approach to these things. So you won't be surprised to know that included on his CV is that he writes for Politically Incorrect Politics. So he's quite proud of that, I think. And he writes for a number of other outlets, including the Times of Israel and the Israel National News. And he is somewhat Israeli, somewhat British, somewhat Romanian. It's a complex mix. But altogether, it produces a very novel approach, and I'm very much looking forward to this evening's session. Over to you, Noru.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you for raising the expectations. I can only disappoint now, but thank you all for attending as well. Thanks for coming and listening to me. Let me see. It's okay. So I'm not going to waste your time by going into details of the outcomes of the recent bout of violence between Israel and Gaza, because I think it's been all over the news, and I'm sure you know the numbers and you know everything about it. But really the question I'd like to approach is, why did this happen? And if you read the mainstream media, if you listen to the politicians, I think they all agree that it's all about clashes in Jerusalem. I'm going to, okay, pointer options, okay. So it's all about clashes in Jerusalem. And the BBC even has published a timeline of the events. It starts with clashes at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, and then Palestinian anger over the potential Sheikh Jarrah evictions, clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and so on and so forth. They all seem to agree with this. And the only problem I have with this narrative is none of this is new. I mean, clashes at the Damascus Gate and terror attacks and so on are quite a frequent matter. They happen certainly around Ramadan, but they happen a lot. They happen, as you can see, at least once a year, let me say. So that's not new. And similarly, there have been evictions of Palestinians from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and from other neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. Over the years, there have been quite a few of them. And similarly, clashes on the Temple Mount near Al-Aqsa Mosque, as they say, are also relatively frequent. You know, they happen every now and then. So, you know, again, none of this is new. Okay, there was something new actually in 2018, really new, revolutionary. Trump moving the US embassy to Jerusalem. We were told at the time by some outlets that this will cause a new intifada, maybe a jihad, a holy war in the Middle East. It didn't happen. As you can see here, the pundits were left to explain why it didn't happen. So we've got this situation where something that has happened many times before, this time, you know, caused something different. And really the question we should ask is, I know it's not Pesach, and this actually happened during Ramadan, not Pesach. But I think the question is pertinent. You know, Manishtana, what was different this time? And in order to try to explain this and go to the real causes of the conflict, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with good old BBC. You know, this didn't happen and didn't start in April. I'm going to have to take you back to January 2021. In January 2021, the Palestinian Authority, its leader, Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, announced elections among Palestinians for the first time in 15 years. In fairness, he did announce elections before, but nobody, you know, he canceled them quite quickly. This time, some people believed him. He seemed to mean it this time. I don't know if you know this. Palestinians don't have a lot of elections. I'm sure you know that, but they are one of the most surveyed population in the world, in the entire world. Everybody wants to know what the Palestinians think, and so there are lots of opinion polls like this one. The one in December 2020 showed that 3/4 of Palestinians want elections, surprise, surprise, and 2/3 of them want to get rid of Mr. Abbas. So why would he call elections, you're asking? Well, because he might not have been popular, but the poll also showed that his movement, Fatah, surprisingly perhaps, was leading in the poll its adversaries, Hamas. And not just that, but this seemed to be kind of steady, you know, over a few months. That's not common in the Palestinian politics. And so perhaps Mr. Abbas thought this is an opportunity, but something else happened in January as well. The Biden administration came to power, and one of the first things they did was to announce that they will restore the financial aid to the Palestinian Authority, which had been cut off by his predecessor, Trump. This money is very, very important for the Palestinian Authority. It is by far the largest employer of Palestinians, and they pay a lot of salaries, and they use these salaries to, you know, buy themselves influence and support. So you can understand, like any good politician, Mr. Abbas thought, oh, I'm leading in the polls, or the movement leads in the polls. I'm going to get a bunch of money that can only help me. So this is the time to have elections. But what he didn't foresee, unfortunately for him, was that he had adversaries not just in Hamas, but in his own movement. And Fatah split in those months leading to the election, split into 4 factions, I think, that competed with each other. And so by March, it was pretty clear that if, and it's a big if the Palestinian elections proceed, Hamas will win. Okay, now what does a good Palestinian dictator do when it seems he's going to lose the elections? Well, he cancels the elections, of course. Oh, I'm sorry, he didn't cancel them, he delayed them without giving a date. He blamed Israel, of course, but nobody really believed him. And this cancellation caused a lot of anger on the Palestinian street. You can understand that. And I mean, what does a good Palestinian dictator do when people are angry with him? He needs to deflect that anger. And who can he deflect that anger onto? Israel, of course. you know, it's their fault. And moreover, why not instigate some clashes, some trouble, you know, hopefully, I'm putting this between scare quotes, hopefully a couple of people will be killed. This will cause a lot of anger, and they will be angry on Israel, not on me. Um, it's something that worked before and will probably work in the future as well. So we can understand now that this list is a list of pretexts, not really causes of the conflict, but pretexts. However, I think it's useful to understand what actually happened there. You know, tachles, as we say, in reality, what happened. So this is the so-called Damascus gate. It leads into the old city of Jerusalem, more precisely into the Muslim quarter of the old city. As you can see, it's quite nice. It's been renovated by Israel. There's this very nice esplanade here. By the way, Damascus Gate is colonial talk. People in the region don't call it anything to do with Damascus, but I'm saying this, you know, because usually newspapers and media outlets don't like colonial nomenclature, but in this case, nobody, it bothers nobody. So Damascus Gate is a bit of a problematic spot. It's especially so during the Ramadan. The Ramadan is a sensitive time of the year. People tend to be more observant, more, the religious sentiment is stronger. They go more often to the mosque. They hear more sermons. You know, it's a time of introspection, perhaps similar in a way to the Yamima Noraim that the Jews have. But also, quite frankly, you know, if you're a young Palestinian, you have to fast during daytime for an entire month and then eat heavily at night. You know, you're hungry during the day. It's not conducive of a very good mood. And what tended to happen in recent years is that Palestinian youth, Arab youth, congregated in the old city or on that esplanade in front of the gate, and picked fights, let me say, or picked trouble, assaulted Jews, especially Haredi Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, who were, you know, wanted to enter the old city or were in the old city. And lately, those youth started to do something else to actually show off their brave exploits on social media. And this attracted some extremist Jews who are also picking, you know, looking for trouble and looking to pour fuel onto the fire. So this usually causes clashes, and then the police has to intervene and disperse them and separate them and so on and so forth. What's happened here? Okay, and this year something else happened as well. We had the COVID pandemic, and somebody at the police must have thought, oh, you know what? We have this huge headache every year on Ramadan with clashes and so on. This year we have COVID. People are not supposed to gather in huge crowds anyway. So let's put barriers and prevent these crowds from congregated on that esplanade. They didn't actually bar the gate. I mean, access was free, but they didn't allow people to congregate on that esplanade that you've seen. Israel wasn't the only country that did things like that, as you can see, but when Israel does it, it's different. So there were clashes with the police. Um, in the big scheme of things, I have to say, and I'm being a little bit cynical here, it wasn't so serious. We've grown a little bit jaded, with these clashes. A few people were injured, some people were arrested. Thank God nobody died, and these things usually fizzle out in a few days. Then we have to turn our attention to the next bit, which is the Sheikh Jarrah potential evictions. First of all, what's this Sheikh Jarrah? First of all, there are actually two small, well, relatively small neighborhoods. One predominantly Arab, one Jewish. They're relatively close to the old city of Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, each of them have a grave of a personality from the past, one Muslim, one Jew. And what happened was that sometime in the 19th century, old Jerusalem became very crowded. Population grew, became very crowded. It was unpleasant to live there. And some rich Arab families decided to move out. They moved to this, what was at the time barren land, and they built some nice houses, some villas. And then other Arab families joined them, not necessarily rich, and Jewish families settled there as well, Jewish institutions as well. And they lived together. I wouldn't go as far as to say they lived in harmony, but they lived together somehow. Until March 1948. March 1948, remember, we are in the midst of the civil war between Jews and Arabs in what was still the British Mandate of Palestine. The British Army was in the process of withdrawing from the place. Remember, they would completely withdraw by mid-May. And so the British Army told the Jews in Sheikh Jarrah, you better bugger off because we can't protect you anymore and you'll be massacred. And that's what they did. Eventually, ultimately, Jordan occupied the place, and it confiscated the Jewish houses and the Jewish land that were there, and put it under a government body, Jordanian government body called the Custodian of Enemy Property. Okay, and then 8 years later, they brought 28 families of Arab refugees and settled them in those Jewish buildings on that land. If Israel did this today, it would be called, of course, an illegal settlement on occupied land. But at the time when Jordan did it, nobody was too bothered. The UN actually cooperated with this. Of course, these 28 families did not own the place. They paid rent to the custodian of enemy property. Come 1967, the situation kind of reverses itself. Israel conquers East Jerusalem along with other territories, but it treats East Jerusalem differently from the other territories. It annexes it. It incorporates it into Israel proper. It puts it under Israeli civilian law, not military law. So it becomes part of Israel. And if it becomes part of Israel, the Jews and Jewish organizations begin to reassert ownership rights over pieces of land and buildings that were left there. The whole thing goes to court and is being adjudicated in court for some years, At some point, the Palestinian residents, the people who lived in those houses or on that land, and the Jewish owners or the claimants made an agreement, a settlement, okay? The Palestinians admitted that they are not the owners of that land, of those buildings. Somebody else owns them. They accepted to pay rent just like they paid before rent to the custodian in return for the status of protected tenants. Protected tenants is a status in law. Basically, it means that as long as you continue to pay rent, you're allowed to stay there. You can't be evicted. Okay, you're permanent. But somebody really didn't like that agreement, the PLO, because that agreement implied that Jews have rights, own things, they have land rights and so on in East Jerusalem. We can't have that. And so they applied pressure. The PLO and later the Palestinian Authority that it established applied pressure on the residents, and they withdrew from this agreement. They said, "Oh no, we've been tricked into signing. We didn't understand what we were signing." And they refused to pay rent. This is critical. They refused to pay rent. Why do I say it's critical? Remember, they are protected tenants. That means they can't be evicted as long as they pay rent. But now they refuse to pay rent. They can be evicted. Not easily, by the way. You've got to serve them notice and wait and then serve them another notice and so on. Eventually, the thing went to court and slowly moved through the courts. The issue of ownership was disputed again. Every trick in the book was used to delay, to obfuscate the process. We have documents, we need to search for ownership documents, we need time and so on and so forth. Eventually, the courts issued rulings in the various cases, and Palestinians were evicted from some of these buildings, from some of these lands. In April this year, the case of 4 Palestinian families reached the final stage. An appeal, the Supreme Court of Israel accepted their appeal and accepted to examine their appeal and set the date of the 10th of May for the ruling, the final ruling on the case. But it also suggested to the sides to negotiate and make an agreement, perhaps, because we don't really want to evict people from their homes. Better make an agreement and we won't have to issue a ruling. But no such agreement was reached. And of course, there were clashes there as well, and trouble, and international criticism, and so on and so forth. The state of Israel, or the government of Israel, said, look, we are not a party in this law case. The state is not involved in this. This is a real estate conflict between private individuals or institutions that are not state institutions, are private institutions. So we don't have a horse in this race. What do you want from us? But critics like Yachad here in the UK said, that's not true at all, because the way the Israeli law is set up, Jews who lost property in 1948 in East Jerusalem are able to claim back their property. But Arabs, Palestinians who left property, left houses, left land in what is today Israel, they can't claim them back. So that's racism, that's discrimination. right? Now, why does this happen? Why is it that Palestinians, let's say a Palestinian family who lives in Lebanon, okay, and or indeed in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, why can't they claim ownership of a house or a piece of land that they owned in what is today Israel? Because Israel has a law enacted in 1950 and called the absentees property law. This is an English translation. Obviously, the original is in Hebrew. I won't ask you to read the entire law. I simplified it a lot, but without changing the essence. And the essence is, in layman terms, if during Israel's War of Independence, which, as we know, was an existential war for the new state, if you moved from the territory of the state of Israel to an enemy country, say Syria, or to the territory occupied by an enemy army, then we consider that you sided with the enemy and you're suspect in our eyes. And because of that, we will take whatever immovable property you left behind, a house or a piece of land, and we will put it under a government body called the Custodian for Absentees Property. Remember the Jordanian custodian for enemy property? This is the same. So both countries did the same. The only difference is that Israel didn't call it enemy property, called it absent. You can understand why. This is 1950, so there is a bit of hope at the time that we'll make peace soon. Well, we had a war, but we'll make peace. This is what happens after wars. And so we don't necessarily want to call them enemies. We'll call them absentees. Now, this is what the law says. What the law doesn't say, despite what Yahad claims, the law doesn't say that it's applicable only to Arabs and not to Jews. Nowhere in the law does it say something like that. But in practice, I don't think many Jews, moved from Israel to Syria or moved from Israel to an area occupied by the Iraqi army. I don't think that happened a lot. It happened mostly with Arabs, with Palestinians, not with Jews. Also, the law doesn't say, look, this property is confiscated forever. It's ours now. It's not yours anymore. It doesn't say that. It sets the custodian to administer that property. And it says exactly the opposite, in fact. It says this will continue until the government will decide otherwise. Meaning it leaves the door open for a settlement sometime in the future, maybe compensation, maybe exchange of property, something like that. Still, the fact is that, as I said, the Palestinian who lives today in Lebanon cannot retrieve his house, if it still exists, or his or her land in Israel. That's the fact, according to this law. So is this racism? Is this discrimination? Well, it is perhaps a form of discrimination, but it turns out that this is common practice. This is what countries do in time of conflict. For instance, India had a conflict with Pakistan, and what it did, it confiscated Pakistani property. And by that, I mean not just property of the Pakistani state, but of Pakistani citizens, private citizens. It confiscated it and put it under the custodian for enemy property. Okay, according to the law, so and so and so. And by the way, this custodian, Indian custodian, is very interesting because they actually have a website. And the website, it's interesting here, if you look here, it defines who are these enemies and the enemy property. You know, persons who migrated to Pakistan or residents of Pakistan during that and that. This is almost, I would say, carbon copy of the absentee law property. It's not just India, the UK did exactly the same, and in fact worse during the Second World War. And by the way, after the war as well, you know, some of this property was never returned to the owners. Canada did actually much worse. They didn't just take away the properties or the assets of German citizens and Japanese citizens during the war, but they actually grabbed the assets of Canadian citizens of Japanese extraction. Moreover, those were considered security threats and they were imprisoned in camps. Some of them were used as forced laborers on farms in Canada. Their property, as I said, was seized by the custodian of enemy property. I'm talking about the property of Canadian citizens of Japanese ethnicity, not of Japanese citizens. Of course, that one was grabbed. And some of that property was sold off and the proceeds were used to pay for their own imprisonment, believe it or not. There was persecution that continued long after the war, for years after the war, until 46 years afterwards, those who survived of those Canadian citizens of Japanese extraction got some money in full and final compensation. There was a settlement there at some point. So I guess what I'm saying is what Israel did isn't, it may sound to people, you know, it may sound to us or to those of us who were born in peacetime and lived always in peacetime and in quiet and everything okay. It may sound unfair and, you know, but this is what countries do in times of conflict, because part of that conflict is to deny the enemy resources, including property, including taxes that they can levy on that property, and so on and so forth. So I guess we begin to understand that these things were really pretexts, not really causes of the conflict. And the clashes at the Damascus Gate and the clashes at Sheikh Jarrah and the whole, you know, international propaganda about Sheikh Jarrah, the whole thing was orchestrated initially by the Palestinian Authority, including the clashes were triggered by elements of the PLO, of the Palestinian Authority, who wanted to deflect the anger caused by canceling the elections, and also wanted to continue to portray themselves as leaders of the Palestinian struggle, because that's what keeps them in power, basically. But somebody really didn't like all this. And I don't just mean Israel, I mean Hamas. Hamas sees itself as leading the Palestinian struggle. They think their way is the way that will, you know, will bring the, you know, the new era for the Palestinians. So they have to do something to reassert themselves. They've been denied elections. They've been denied victory in elections as they see it. So they trigger these clashes at a sensitive holy site. Hamas is a religious organization. Its supporters tend to be, observant, pious Muslims, and the place to heat up the whole thing is at a holy site. But before going into what happened there, I'd like to do a small test here. You can see here 4 buildings, and I will run in a moment poll, an opinion poll, and I'd like you to tell me which of these buildings is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, which of these buildings is the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Let me see if I can find how I run the. Maybe I can't run it if I'm sharing my screen. Let me see. Okay, so this is the poll. Okay, all vote now, please. Okay, I'll end the poll here and share my screen again. Right, so I think you can see the results of the poll, and I have to take my hat off for this audience. This is a very, very knowledgeable audience. Thank you. This is not what I expected, because most people I know, if I asked this question, would have said D. But you're absolutely right. The correct answer is A. Okay, most people, including most people of Arab extraction in the UK, of Muslim extraction in the UK and in the world, would have pointed to picture D as being Al-Aqsa. But picture D not only isn't Al-Aqsa, this is Al-Aqsa Mosque. D isn't a mosque at all. It's a shrine. It's a monumental building with a lot of religious importance, but it's not a mosque. It's not a place where people come to pray inside. However, it is the picture or the symbol of Al-Aqsa Mosque. You'll find it everywhere, standing for Al-Aqsa Mosque. The reason for that, obviously the two are not far apart geographically, but also, Al-Aqsa is very important, but it's not a very impressive building, while this is. I mean, you look at the other mosques, they look more impressive. In fact, you can see them both here. This is Al-Aqsa, and this is the Dome of the Rock with the very impressive golden spire. And they're both part of a complex alongside other buildings, other elements. There's a large esplanade here. There's some greenery. It's all part of a complex, and it's close to another very important a religious site, which is the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, it used to be called. You can see there's an esplanade here as well, and people are visiting and praying and pushing bits of paper into the wall, and so on and so forth. From the point of view of topography, very importantly, this esplanade is high above this one, which is important because when you have riots here, especially Palestinian youth, it's very easy to lob rocks, large rocks and bottles and some even less pleasant things onto the heads of the people below, the visitors, the worshippers below. This is perhaps the main reason why the Israeli police intervenes when there are riots like that. And you know, this happened many times in the past. It will probably continue to happen in the future, unfortunately. Now, as the BBC explains here very nicely, they got the proportion of the buildings wrong, but everything else is very nice. They have this sketch here, and as they explain, the Jews call the area Har Habayit, which translates as the Temple Mount, and the Muslims or the Arabs call it Haram al-Sharif. That means the noble sanctuary. This is all very nicely explained here by the BBC. And indeed, the BBC used that terminology for many years, both names, in order to kind of create balance and you know, convey the fact that the place is holy to both religions. And it's not just the BBC. I mean, the International Press Institute also says exactly the same thing. Jews call it the Temple Mount. They should really say Jews call it Har Habayit, but never mind. And Palestinians and Muslims refer to it as Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. That's all true. I don't have any problem with that. But more recently, certainly referring to the clashes that were there, the BBC, and not just the BBC, I'm picking on the BBC, the mainstream media in general changed the terminology. You see, they say here the clashes took place near the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And refer on the same day, you see it's the same day here, referring to the same clashes and using even the same picture, they now say not just near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. What does that mean, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque? If I say I'm at the theater, people will understand I'm inside the theater watching a performance. That's what people do at the theater. If I say I'm at the mosque, people will understand I'm in the mosque praying, because that's what you do in a mosque. But they started using another terminology as well, Al-Aqsa compound or Al-Aqsa Mosque complex. So no longer do they use, you know, Temple Mount / Haram al-Sharif, which they told us that's how the place is called. That's how Muslim called it, Haram al-Sharif. No, now they use Al-Aqsa compound. Why did they change the terminology all of a sudden? Well, for years, the Palestinian Authority, or the State of Palestine, as they call themselves, the Palestine Liberation Organization, Negotiations Affairs Department, I don't know what this has to do with negotiations, but anyway, they have been putting pressure on foreign journalists to stop using what they call the inaccurate term Temple Mount. Okay, well, okay, the Palestinian Authority claims there was never a temple there, in any case, okay? But it's not just that. Now they claim, actually, the entire complex, all 36 acres of it, esplanade, greenery, everything that's inside those walls, it's all a mosque, okay? It's all part of the mosque. It's all Al-Aqsa. So the BBC was wrong with this sketch. All this is Al-Aqsa, they say. And that makes the Western Wall one of the walls of the mosque. And indeed, in school, in manuals, in textbooks for the primary school, used in the Palestinian Authority. They call it the Al-Burak wall, one of the walls of Al-Aqsa. They even say that to call it the Temple Mount is a breach of international law, because this is over the green line. It's in Palestine. So how can you call it the Temple Mount if it's in Palestine? And the mainstream media, accepted it. They call it the Al-Aqsa compound because they have been told to call it Al-Aqsa compound. But where did these clashes actually happen? Geographically, not politically, but geographically. Where did they happen? You can see here, most of them happened on the large esplanade, actually near the Dome of the Rock, not near the mosque at all. But we are being told that, it's all mosque. It's all part of the mosque. So is it or isn't it? Well, in order to answer this question, I suggest we focus for a moment not on the Israeli soldiers, like journalists generally do, but on the Palestinians. For once, let's focus on the Palestinians. For instance, on this chap. Let's zoom in. Well, I don't know about you, but I think it seems to me that he wears shoes. Would a Muslim wear shoes in a mosque? I mean, all of them wear shoes. Look, they all wear shoes. So it's not really a mosque. This is outside the mosque. The claim that it's all a mosque is really a politicized claim. It's a way to try to appropriate the whole thing and deny the Jewish connection to the place. But of course, if you are somebody, from the street who doesn't know a lot and isn't that interested in these matters, if you hear terminology like at the mosque, in the mosque compound, it makes it sound as if the Israeli police burst into the mosque to fight the Palestinians there. Also, this is exacerbated by media like the BBC, for instance, calling the Palestinians who clashed with the police worshippers. Now, I think worshippers were inside the mosque praying, and people who rioted outside should be called rioters. But anyway, that's... Now, some journalists went a step further, and in my opinion, a step way too far. For instance, these two journalists from the New York Times call the whole thing a raid on Aqsa Mosque. So this is not a police operation, not even a brutal police operation. It's a raid on the mosque. To do what? To occupy the mosque, demolish it, what? It's not clear. You might call this biased journalism. I call it irresponsible and, frankly, even criminal journalism, because this kind of talk, this kind of irresponsible talk can lead to bloodshed, can even, lead to murder. We have not just irresponsible journalists, but also irresponsible politicians. One British well, she wouldn't call herself a British politician, but this politician claimed that Israel attacked the mosque. Okay, you can imagine if you are an observant, a pious Muslim here in the UK who feels a connection to the holy sites and so on, and you're being told that Israel attacked those holy sites, that will make your blood boil. But even if you're not an observant Muslim or no Muslim at all, and you hear that Israel attacked a holy site, a Muslim holy site, then you might say, well, maybe Hamas is, is entitled to intervene to defend that holy site. Because that's exactly what happened. Hamas, being denied victory in elections as they hoped, sees an opportunity here. They don't just start the clashes, they do start the clashes. You can see the flags, they chanted, "We are all Hamas," and so on. But by the way, we make a mistake here. We tend to associate Hamas with the Gaza Strip. They rule the Gaza Strip, that's true, but Hamas is among Palestinians everywhere. They have a lot of influence in the West Bank. They don't rule the West Bank, but they have a lot of influence. They even have influence among Israeli Arabs, some Israeli Arabs, certainly. And Hamas decides to up the ante and launches rockets on Jerusalem, no less. Not on Sderot, not on Ashkelon, on Jerusalem. Of course, these weapons are quite inaccurate. They might well fall in Arab neighborhoods. They might even fall on the mosque. But Hamas doesn't care about that. They want to be seen not just as leaders of the Palestinian struggle, but as defenders of Al-Aqsa, on behalf of the Muslim world, not just the Palestinian world. That, they think, will bring them not just glory, but money and support. So, I'm afraid what really happened here was a conflict between Hamas and Fatah, a struggle for power, for popularity, for support. To use a more seasonal metaphor, this was a match between Hamas and Fatah, with Israel, I'm afraid, cast as the football in this whole thing. Now, before I have a little bit more, but before I do that, maybe we take a few minutes for I want to break this a little bit. Maybe we take a few minutes for a question and answer session. After that, I have a few more slides, and then we will have a longer session, a longer question session. Judy, do we have any questions?
I haven't seen any in the chat, so maybe we need people to be spontaneous. Anybody has a question?
In fairness, we didn't tell people that they can ask questions in the chat, so.
We'll take this opportunity to say that if you want to ask questions after the end of the session, please put your questions in the chat.
Okay, I'll go on then, and as I said, we'll have time for questions at the end. I only have a few more slides, so I promised to deal with why all this happened, but whatever the reasons, we know what happened. An exchange of fire, rockets onto Israel, bombs onto Gaza, and people died, including, unfortunately, innocent people in Israel and in Gaza, including, even more unfortunately, children in Israel and in Gaza. And I'd like to try and explain a little bit, not necessarily by way of polemic, but from almost, I would say, from a military point of view, why do these people die? And I'm going to do this, the examples I'm going to use are not the examples from the recent conflagration. but from 2014. And the reason for that is the events from 2014 were fully investigated. So we know the facts, while the recent ones are still under investigation. But I can promise you that what happened this year is not so different from what happened in 2014. So first of all, I mean, I promised no polemic, and this isn't, I think, polemic is something that needs to be said, is that innocents unfortunately die every time there is a military operation, there is a war. This is not necessarily illegal. It's not a sign that a crime has been committed unless they were hit deliberately or carelessly or disproportionately. And the word disproportionate, it doesn't mean that more people died in Gaza than in Israel, and that's disproportionate. That's not the proportion that the law refers to. The law refers to disproportionate versus the desired military advantage. To give a very clear example, if I kill 20 civilians to get to one soldier, that will be disproportionate without doubt. Now, Israel is making unprecedented efforts to avoid hitting innocents, and I'll go through it very quickly. We're talking about careful analysis and selection of targets. There are targets files. Choice of weapon and ammunition, the precise weapons and ammunition that try to destroy only the target and not around the target. Real-time target monitoring, that usually means a drone that flies high in the sky above the target, monitors the target so that the strike can be aborted if the situation changes. For instance, if civilians approach. And pre-strike warnings, things like leaflets like these or like these, mobile phone messages, the so-called knock on the roof. This is when a dud is fired at the roof of a building to signify that the building is going to be attacked. So people have time to leave the building before it is attacked with a real ammunition. And no less important, training. You see this here. It looks like an Arab village. It isn't. It's an Israeli military installation. I trained in such an installation, okay? And they trained me, among other things, on how to recognize, how to differentiate between armed combatants and unarmed civilians. It's also true that Hamas does the exact opposite. They are interested in blurring the distinction between military and civilian. We know that. They fire rockets from residential areas. Now, I was saying something like that at a meeting in the past, and somebody approached me and said, what do you want these people to do? Gaza is so crowded, it's all residential, crowded residential area. What do you want them? If they are to fire rockets, they have to do it from a residential area. Fortunately, we have something called Google Earth, okay? And I invite you to look via Google Earth on Gaza Strip, and you'll see that, yes, there are many such crowded residential areas, but there are also many agricultural area. This is an agriculture. These are fields with the occasional farm. So Hamas could, if they wanted to, could fire their rockets from this area. Gaza has quite an impressive agricultural production, by the way. But of course, they're not interested to do it from this area because that would make them vulnerable. It's also true that a high proportion of rockets launched from Gaza fall inside Gaza, and some of them kill people in Gaza. And also, Hamas uses children or youngsters in military operations. You know, when they tell you 60 children were killed in Gaza, the meaning is 60 minors under the age of 18. But Hamas uses many 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds and younger than that in their operations to help launch rockets for their other operations as well. And finally, it's also true that Hamas seeks to inflate the number of casualties, especially children, for their propaganda value. Sometimes it's a very crude attempt. They published pictures of children that were not even Palestinian children. But, you know, it's easy if a Hamas operative aged 25 dies, it's easy to publish a picture from when he was 16 or 17. But when we take all these things into consideration, you know, the people killed by rockets from Gaza and all that, it's still true that some innocents die at Israeli hands because of Israeli attacks, because of Israeli strikes. And my purpose here, my main purpose here, is to explain why this happens, despite all the efforts and so on. So one of the reasons, I'm going to only deal with the reasons that are relevant to the last conflict, because we didn't have a ground operation. If there's a ground operation, then there are other reasons as well. But these are relevant to airstrikes. So shrapnel, secondary explosions, and other unintended consequences. Anything to do with rockets in Gaza Strip is an Israeli target, of course, in principle. You know, manufacturing facilities, storage facilities, and launching facilities. Like this launch pad for rockets. As you can see, this has been destroyed. You can see that it was in the vicinity of buildings, of houses. You can see that it was taken out rather surgically. These houses they are in immediate vicinity, but they were not destroyed. And you can see here something else. This is the entrance or the exit, however you want to look at it, to a tunnel. These are the tunnels which are used to bring the rockets and to operate and launch the rockets and for the operatives to flee and so on and so forth. Now, you can take out, as I said, surgically this type of launch pad, but what we don't usually know, we can't know, is, for instance, how much ammunition, how many rockets are stored inside this tunnel, in this area. What kind of tunnel it is. What else is there, explosives and so on. You may hit this with precision ammunition, and that is not supposed to harm anything else. But the secondary explosions caused by the rockets that are stored there, by fuel that is stored there for the rockets, by explosives, can blow up an entire street. And in fact, the tunnel itself can collapse and demolish the houses that are above it. This happened in this round of hostilities, okay? An entire area, an entire portion of a street collapsed because the tunnel underneath it collapsed. And also, what we don't know is explosions create shrapnel. That shrapnel can fly sometimes hundreds of meters, and of course can kill people. This is what happened here, where a Red Crescent station, an ambulance station, was hit. The matter was investigated. It turns out that the station wasn't hit directly by any Israeli strike. It was hit by shrapnel resulting from secondary explosions, not from the explosion of the actual ammunition, but from secondary explosions that happened there. One more reason why people die is faulty or incomplete intelligence. By all reckoning, Israeli intelligence about the Gaza Strip is brilliant. It's one of it's very rare that an army has so much intelligence about the enemy, but no intelligence is perfect. That's what happened here, for instance. An 8-story building was attacked. In fact, what was attacked was the 5th floor of that building. That floor was destroyed inside. The floors above that were lightly damaged, but despite that, 12 people were killed, 5 of them children. It turns out that why was that building hit? The target was a certain high-rank Islamic Jihad commander, who indeed was among the fatalities. The reason the building was attacked is because there was intelligence that that man was there in a particular office on the 5th floor. And so they attacked in late evening. This was an office building. So, you know, people don't generally work late at night in an office building. And also, it was attacked with precision munition designed to destroy only inside the 5th floor and not demolish the entire building. But what the intelligence didn't reveal is that there was a family who had taken refuge on that exact floor in an office on the 5th floor of that building. Nobody knew they were there. They fled another area of conflict. They fled their neighborhood. They found refuge there. Maybe they had a relative who owned offices there and allowed them to live there. And they were killed in this strike. Now, finally, I promised to refer to the question of whether this will ever end. A small question, you know, unimportant. And the first thing I will say, I don't consider myself a great Middle Eastern expert, but even if there are experts, don't necessarily believe them.
There will be no advance and separate peace with the Arab world without the Palestinian process and Palestinian peace. Everybody needs to understand that. That is a hard reality.
Well, it turns out it's not quite such a hard reality.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing today a new trend that will create a better path for the Middle East. This peace accord, which is a historic achievement for the United States of America, the State of Israel, and the United Arab Emirates, will continue to have a positive impact as we believe that...
So, about 3 years after that impassioned speech of John Kerry, who said no Arab-Israeli peace is possible without first resolving the Palestinian issue, it turns out that it is possible, it was possible, it did happen. So don't necessarily believe the experts and the pundits. Don't necessarily believe me either, but I promised you to give you an opinion. So I don't think that this will end anytime soon, certainly not as long as Hamas benefits from the whole thing. And unfortunately, they do benefit. Remember this opinion poll in September 2020. This is before, okay, the before situation, and this is the after situation. You can see that the situation reversed itself. Now Hamas leads in the polls. If the elections were taking place tomorrow, they would win them easily. So they gained support among Palestinians because of this confrontation. because they show they're tough with Israel, and they excite the pride and so on. Now, one thing has to be said. All those in the West, politicians, journalists, pundits, who create this situation or contribute to this situation where Hamas benefits in terms of propaganda from this violence, they are, in my eyes, guilty. They are responsible for the next bout of violence. They make the next bout of violence almost inevitable. These people, I have to say in blunt words, have blood on their hands. Now, I always like to finish on an optimistic note. So I was looking for an optimistic note here, and the best I can do is, all things must end. Historically, all conflicts in the history of mankind ended at some point, and this one will end as well. All good things must come to an end, but fortunately also all bad things must come to an end. Perhaps not very soon, but end it will. That's it, folks. Thank you very much for listening to me. And now if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Many thanks, Noru. We've got a few things in the chat. I'll start with the first one from Maya Green. He said that he protested to Nicola, I assume he means Nicola Sturgeon, but received a bland response irrelevant to the point which he raised. So how can we communicate the accurate account of events to Nicola, etc., if our protests are deflected with bland replies?
How can we communicate the accurate account of events to Nicola? I think, I don't underestimate. I might underestimate the honesty of a politician like Nicola Sturgeon, but I certainly don't underestimate her intelligence. I don't think that she doesn't understand the reality. I don't for a moment believe that, it's a matter of explaining the facts to her because she doesn't get them. I don't think that's true. I think she gets it. But politically, it's a matter of ideology for her. And it's also a matter of, it's politically convenient. It's politically convenient. Unfortunately, the number of Jews in Scotland isn't great. And the number of pro-Palestinian, activists of various kinds is larger. It's politically convenient for her to take this position. I think it's completely irresponsible, as I said. I think it's almost criminal. I think in a way she has blood on her hands for doing that because she makes bloodshed more likely. But I don't think I don't think it's a matter of communication, honestly. I think we need to contradict her rather than persuade her, if I'm making any sense.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Sarah Wald. What sort of pressure did the PLO put on the media to use the term Al-Aqsa complex, and how come they have such a strong influence? Can you also explain the relationship between Fatah and PLO?
Okay, so I'll start with the second part of the question because it's the more straightforward one. The PLO is an umbrella organization that binds together, actual organizations. And Fatah is the largest and dominant organization among those. So it's the dominant force within the PLO. simple as that. Now, it's a very good question. How can Palestinians have such an influence and so on and so forth? Part of it is ideological and part of it is practical, okay? I'll start with the practical one again because it's more straightforward. Let's get that out of the way. So practically speaking, if you're not on good terms with the Palestinian Authority, with the PLO, with Fatah, you're not going to have much success as a journalist reporting from the West Bank, from Judea and Samaria, okay? Because the vast majority of the journalists sent there don't speak the local languages, they don't speak Arabic, they don't speak Hebrew, they depend on local fixers, and these fixers are generally either provided by Fatah or very strong under Fatah influence, because let's remember, this is not a democracy. If they step out of line as in their contacts with foreign journalists, they're not going to have a very happy life after that in that place. So, you know, if you want to get news, if you want to be tipped when there's a clash somewhere, so you can report about it from the place. If you want to get half digested news, you know, and all these and opinions and interviews and so on, you better be on the right side of the Palestinian Authority, of the PLO and so on. This is what it's like working with a regime that isn't a democracy, okay? They control things. So that's the practical side, but there is also an ideological side. A lot of the foreign journalists, let's say that come from the UK, come with a certain ideological baggage, with a certain anti-colonial frame of mind, okay, where they feel sorry for the Palestinians. They see them as victims, as underdog. They tend to sympathize with them and not with Israel, which they see as the powerful side of the equation, okay? And also, many of these Western journalists, as I said, come with almost, I would say, a sort of guilt, of colonial guilt. Someone once, I heard someone, someone who considered himself a pro-Palestinian activist, and he said, you know, we killed all those Indians in America, we killed people in India, we killed people in Kenya. Let's at least save these Palestinians. So, you know, they bring this baggage of colonial guilt and apply it in a very stupid way, but they do apply it. And this, you know, this ideological baggage causes them to kind of side with the Palestinians. There's also a kind of legalistic frame of mind that outlets like the BBC take. You know, the BBC gets a lot of complaints and they have they feel they have to defend themselves. You'd be surprised how defensive they are, the BBC. They feel under attack, okay? We see them as all powerful sometimes, but they feel under attack. And in their mind, the best way to defend themselves is to go by the UN. You know, the UN takes a certain view. We align our view with the UN. Nobody can say that we are biased. This is the UN, okay? So you saw that bit where it said that it's a breach of international law to call it the Temple Mount. The Palestinians included that paragraph. They pressed that particular button because they know it works. The moment they cited, by the way, I didn't show you, they quoted a UN resolution there that says that anything that is done by Israel in East Jerusalem is null and void. They use those terms. And the BBC and other outlets tend to align themselves with that. Okay, if the UN calls it Haram al-Sharif, if the UN calls it Al-Aqsa, that's how we're going to call it. This way, we can respond to complaints that the UN said.
So there is a question asking what can we do to improve our media coverage, but perhaps you've covered that. In which case we'll move on to the next question. Hitting innocents during military ops is lawful, you say. Is that the Geneva Convention? That's Ashley Dixon.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood that.
Right, he said, hitting innocents during military ops is lawful, you say. Is that the Geneva Convention?
Yes, it is actually. Well, they don't say, the law doesn't usually say what is lawful. It says what is unlawful. Living in your own house isn't enshrined in law. Stealing is enshrined in law. So the law tells us what is illegal. And these laws, the laws of war, I mean, the Geneva Convention is just one of them. What is called the laws of warfare, the jus bello, they tell us in which cases killing protected persons, by the way, the law doesn't necessarily use the term civilian or innocent. They use the term protected persons, which includes what we would call civilians. And killing these protected persons is illegal if done deliberately, if done carelessly. That means doing something that a reasonable person must anticipate that would cause killing of protected persons. That's, doing it carelessly or doing it disproportionately, as I said. Okay, so let me take the opposite example from the one I used in the presentation. If 20 enemy soldiers are firing on you and they hide behind a civilian, they have a civilian in front of them to kind of protect them, and they fire on you, you are allowed to fire back, even if you risk killing that civilian. Okay, so there's an issue. Now, what the law doesn't say, it doesn't tell us, it doesn't teach us what is proportional or what isn't proportional. That is left to the judges to kind of determine what would be proportional, what wouldn't be proportional. And of course, various people make various determinations. There are many NGOs, many charities who consider that, if an uninvolved civilian was killed, whatever the circumstances, then it's a war crime for them, okay? They ignore the proportionality thing. And of course, a military man would see the things slightly different, or most military men would see things slightly different. But this is left to, what I meant by lawful is that the mere fact that an innocent person was killed does not mean that a crime was committed. That's what I meant. Does not necessarily mean that a crime was committed.
Thank you, Noru. So there's a question, why did the Israeli police get involved at the Damascus gate? Couldn't they have allowed the young men to assemble there and leave them alone? That's from Danny Hable.
Very good question. Thank you. I should have made this clear, and clearly I didn't make clear, so I'll make it clear now. One of the reasons why Damascus Gate is such a problematic area is that it's an area where Jews and Arabs or Palestinians come in contact, because Damascus Gate, as I said, is a gate leading into the old city, into the Muslim quarter of the old city, but it also leads further on to the Western Wall. So Haredi people, you know, religious people, not just religious perhaps, but mainly religious people who want to go to the Western Wall, pass through that area. Now, when you have this sort of as I said in the presentation, when you have this sort of crowd, especially during Ramadan, which, as I said, is such a sensitive time, you have Jews passing there. They are often assaulted. The police intervenes. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if a Palestinian crowd was rioting in an empty square somewhere, not bothering anyone else, I rather doubt that the Israeli police would want to intervene, to seek trouble there. But the police is there to protect people, and people who are assaulted need to be protected by police. So that's why the police intervenes. Now, it's not that simple, quite that simple, and it's not one-sided, because, as I said, extremist Jews sometimes, you know, seek trouble there. They don't usually start the trouble, but they react and they pour fuel on the fire. And then the police has to intervene to separate the two sides and keep them from, you know, bludgeoning each other.
Ryan Fink asks, Israel could not allow Hamas to take over from Fatah in the West Bank after what happened in Gaza. How could it prevent this if Hamas did at some point win an election?
There is a very good question. Thank you. Thank you, first of all. There is very little chance that an election will take place as long as Hamas is likely to win. You know, in the Middle East, there aren't many, as we know, there aren't many free elections. And when there are elections, they're usually won by 90-something%. Okay. When in the Middle East, losing power for a dictator in the Middle East, losing power often equates losing one's life. And so I rather doubt that Mr. Mahmoud Abbas and the other people, I mean, you know, he's not a young man, but the other people in the leadership of Fatah, of the PLO, of the Palestinian Authority, I rather doubt they will allow free elections if they have any doubt that they will win. And in fact, the main leverage that the Palestinian Authority has against Israel, you can hear when they get cross with Israel, they say, oh, we'll dissolve the authority. We'll let you deal with things. We'll dissolve the authority, because they say, you know, we're the lesser evil. You've got to be nice to us. You've got to protect us. And Israel does protect them. You know, the truth is that the Palestinian Authority wouldn't last very long without Israeli soldiers in the vicinity, because the likelihood is Hamas would take over.
Thank you. So there's a comment from Sarah Wald saying, yes, and they totally ignore centuries-long Arab and Muslim colonialism I think that's in reference to young Western people thinking Israel is colonialist. And then there's a question, let me get to it. What happened about the war crime charge against Israel?
Okay, so regarding colonialism, yes, you're right. There was Arab colonialism as well, if we choose to call it like this. There are facts that fit very well that description, but mostly I would say what makes me laugh sometimes is how people ignore the 4 centuries of Ottoman dominance of the Middle East. There is an outfit here in the UK called the Balfour Project, which tries to make Brits feel guilty about the Balfour Declaration and the role that British colonialism had in the Middle East. I'm not saying, the truth is that British colonialism and French colonialism had a very deleterious role in the Middle East and elsewhere. But the Brits ruled the Middle East for what, 25 years, 30 years? This is a very short time in historical terms. The Ottoman Empire ruled it for 400 years. 400 years, okay? The Ottoman Empire had a terrible, I can't say terrible enough, role and influence in the Middle East. It left the Middle East underdeveloped, with a high degree of illiteracy, with culturally in ruin, everything economically very underdeveloped. They kept it as a backwater. The Ottomans were not interested at all in the Middle East. They saw themselves as Europeans. They ruled from Istanbul, not from the Middle East, and they were not interested in the Middle East. They exploited it. They kept it underdeveloped. Horrible role. Much stronger than the 3 or 4 decades of Western dominance in the Middle East. But this is, ideologically, this is an inconvenient fact for those who, want to stress the Western guilt.
So we're well past 9 o'clock now. I don't know how you feel. There's 2 more questions. Have you got the energy to?
I'm happy.
Good.
If people are happy to stay.
A lot of people are making positive comments, and some of them saying they have to leave, but that's fine if anybody wants to leave. But whilst we've got you, let's give you the question. So there's a question from I've lost the from Caroline Smith saying, you haven't commented on the violence between Israeli Arabs and Jews in cities like Lod. I don't recall this happening before.
Yes, excellent question. Excellent question. Thank you very much. As I was preparing this presentation, I thought I'm leaving this out. Now, if you noticed, I promised to tackle a few issues, a few questions in my presentation, and I stuck to that because what you just asked deserves a presentation in itself. Okay, it's not completely true that it never happened before. People forget. There was trouble in Acre, in Akko, in other places. There was even a commission of inquiry at some point about police tackling an Arab-Israeli revolt in some places in the Galilee. So, there were things before, but you're right that it wasn't as strong, as intense as this time. As I said, it deserves a presentation in itself. But if I'm trying to tackle this very shortly, is to say that parts of the of the Arab-Israeli sector, Arab-Israeli community, feel a sense of Palestinian identity. They feel solidarity with their brothers and sisters in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. So, and also, as I said, or Palestinian organizations, including Hamas, have supporters, maybe not formal members, hopefully not formal members, but certainly supporters, sympathizers among Israeli Arabs. It's a fact. We know that there were also Israeli Arabs who traveled to Syria to fight for ISIS. And why wouldn't there be? I mean, as you know, there were people from Britain and from France and elsewhere, including Sweden, that traveled to fight for ISIS. So there is this influence. We must not imagine that when, I mean, the images that you've seen from Lod, from other, what is called mixed cities, were horrible. But we must not imagine that that all or even the majority of the Arab population, or indeed the Jewish population, participated in those clashes, in those events. A minority did, on both sides. Minorities did, not majority. Unfortunately, although in democracy the majority is supposed to rule, often what the minority does, it creates animosity, it creates bitterness, and it has a long-lasting effect on the majority as well. So it carries, often a militant minority carries the majority with it, although it should be the opposite. And that's what happened. Now, this has exacerbated the feelings of, let me say, unfriendliness, animosity, hostility between the two populations. It's horrible. The effect is absolutely horrible. But there is also some ground. I always look for the, for the half full glass. After those events, if somebody looks with a positive outlook, that somebody can also see positive things, like people and organizations, both on the Jewish side and on the Arab side, reapproaching each other and saying, look, we don't agree. This is horrible what these people do. We don't agree with them. We actually want to live together, and so on. This folks, happened as well. It's not always reported, unfortunately, because, unfortunately, there is this effect. The media is looking for things that are interesting, and a dog biting a man isn't interesting. It's something to be expected. A man biting a dog, now that's interesting. And sometimes if you read the media, you get your information only from the media, you run the risk of thinking that men biting dogs is the rule rather than the exception. We can't hear you, Julie.
I just realized, sorry, yes. Mervyn Smith asks, can you discuss why the world ignores that the West Bank and Jordan Valley were allocated to Jews in 1922 and confirmed when Israel was established by the UN article?
Well, I can only tell you from my experience that if I meet people, I mean, this is a special audience that, as I said, is very knowledgeable, and also interested, deeply interested and connected to the subject. But if I speak to people who, you know, are not so connected and so on, the moment I say 1922, their eyes glaze, okay? They're not, this is, you know, ancient history. Who cares? Who cares? We care about the oppressed Palestinians now. Don't bother us with 1922. You know, honestly, try speaking to a group of students and saying, but in 1922, you know, this was given to the Jews. So, unfortunately, I have to say that, you know, in a court of law, perhaps, that would be an interesting argument. But in the court of public opinion, unfortunately, it isn't, and it will never be.
So I think we've got a final question now, which is, will the fact that the present Israeli government includes an Islamist party influence the situation both within Israel and the PA? That's from Ray Wixman.
I didn't get the bit about the PA there.
Will the fact that the Israeli government includes an Islamist party influence the situation both within Israel and in the PA?
Well, I mean, within Israel, clearly there is an influence. First of all, you know, the fact that an Islamist Arab party is part of the Israeli ruling coalition, I think it's even more evidence of the apartheid regime in Israel, clearly. But that, you know, it's no secret to you, I'm sure, that it's a relatively feeble coalition. Ideologically, it's very, very, very extremely, I would say, broad. You know, it includes communists and kind of rather strong right-wingers in the same coalition, and Islamists, and it only has 61, so it only has a majority of 1 in the parliament. So it goes without saying that any small party, including this small, relatively small Islamist party with 4 members of parliament, you know, they have power, they have influence, because they can cause the government to fall at any time. And this was visible only recently when this citizenship law was debated in the parliament. It needed to be extended, or rather, it's not the law itself, it's an emergency regulation that is part of the law and needed to be extended. And these guys said, we're not voting for it. So first of all, there were negotiations to try to find an agreement. But despite the agreement, 2 members of parliament out of those 4 decided to vote again, or to abstain rather. And so they caused the law to fail to pass. So if that's not influence, I don't know what influence is. Regarding the relationship with the PA, this particular party is not very close ideologically to the Palestinian Authority. In a way, it's closer to Hamas, not necessarily in a militant kind of way, but in an ideological kind of way. It's closer to the Muslim Brotherhood in outlook. It's a very conservative party, an anti-gay party, you know, a conservative in terms of women rights and so on. But let me bring in the positive side of it, okay? The fact that Israel, it just brings home to me how creative, how incredibly creative Israelis are. Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. Imagine, I know of no other country where this kind of array of parties, like I said, from Islamists or to almost communists and quite hard right, managed to somehow find common ground in negotiations. You know, it takes a lot of creativity to find some common ground and design an agreement that somehow works for everybody. And it just brings home to me why every time that there was an Arab leader that wanted to make peace with Israel, there was peace. Because in terms of negotiations and creativity and putting together, you know, finding an agreement that somehow covers all bases, you know, Israelis are masters in doing that. Also because every single government is a coalition government.
Thank you. I think it's been an absolutely marvelous evening. You've covered so much territory from so many interesting angles, so informatively. I know lots of people have put comments in the chat line saying how much they appreciated it, but it really was wonderful. Thank you so much, Noru. We'll have you back again soon, I'm sure. So thank you. Are there any final comments you want to make?
Only to thank you, Judy, for organizing this. You know, you're an engine, an absolute engine and the force of nature. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all these good people who, you know, sat here for almost 2 hours now and listened to me. I'm humbled by that. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, much appreciated. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night. Good night, everybody.